How Pinochet saved Chilean democracy. Allende was elected democratically in a very close election, receiving less than 40% of the vote. His goals while in power were very clear, as evidenced by the following quote.
We are moving towards socialism, not from an academic love for a doctrinaire system, but encouraged by the strength of our people, who know that it is an inescapable demand if we are to overcome backwardness, and who feel that a socialist regime is the only way available to modern nations who want to build rationally in freedom, independence, and dignity. We are moving towards socialism because the people, through their vote, have freely rejected capitalism as a system which has resulted in a crudely unequal society, a society deformed by social injustice and degraded by the deterioration of the very foundations of human solidarity.
After being elected, Allende immediately began to implement radical changes to the Chilean economy. Some of his program was pretty reasonable, like offering scholarships to indigenous children or his efforts to spread literacy throughout the country. But other aspects of his agenda were more controversial, like the nationalization of heavy industry or Allende's bastardization of land reform efforts. Allende's agrarian reforms included the expropriation of any state larger than 200 acres, and instead of giving the land directly to the peasants, as had been the case in previous efforts, they established large collective farms. The character of the land reform was also different, as previously it had been state and church land which was redistributed, or private land with compensation. Under Allende, no compensation was offered to private landholders for their seized property. In terms of economic stewardship, the Allende regime was an abject failure. Just 2 years into Allende's reign, inflation, already at 36% when he took office, had shot up to 140%. Chile was now in the midst of an economic crisis. In an attempt to curb the inflation, price controls were implemented, but this simply led to widespread shortages of basic consumer goods. In desperation, the Allende regime turned to Project Cybersign, a futuristic approach to planning the economy through the use of computers. The idea was to connect the central computer to a network of telex devices and feed it real-time data from all the factories in the Chilean economy. Checkmate, Mises! Unfortunately, like so many great socialist ideas, it never got beyond the prototype stage. The economic woes were only part of the problem. After Allende nationalized the copper industry, he alienated the United States, who cut off support for Chile and actively began supporting Allende's political opponents. His radical policies made Chile a pariah among most of South America, which was leaning conservative at the time, except for Peru. Even the Soviet Union was reluctant to send much in the way of aid, although they made some vague promises about foreign investment.
At the end of 1972, things really started to collapse. Capital strikes lead to a heavy-handed response by the socialist regime, and many of Allende's allies in the legislature abandoned him. On June 29, 1973, a colonel and his tank regiment surrounded the presidential palace, La Moneda. This particular coup failed, but was followed by a general strike.
Then in August, the Chamber of Deputies denounced Allende for a serious breach of the constitutional and legal order of the Republic and called upon the armed forces to put an immediate termination of all the factual situations referred to which violate the Constitution and the law, basically calling for an outright military coup. The violations they were referring to include support of armed groups, illegal arrests, torture, the muzzling of the press, manipulation of education, and substituting it for Marxist indoctrination, not allowing people to leave the country, confiscating private property, forming seditious organizations, and usurping powers belonging to the judiciary, Congress, and the Treasury. Now, these accusations weren't coming from Allende's political opponents. They were coming from the Christian Democratic Party, the same party that in 3 years earlier had given all its votes to elect Allende president. Pinochet was born of two middle class bureaucrats. He had a long and distinguished military career, but was not overly ambitious. He was the consummate servant of the Chilean state, loyal, stoic, chaste. When Allende was elected, Pinochet served him faithfully, suppressing opposition to the Marxist leader and even assassinating members of Allende's political circle for him. Not long into Allende's term, the honeymoon began to fade. Allende's radical Marxist program and misguided economic policies ran counter to Pinochet's conservative worldview. However, he hid his disdain for the communist agenda and was appointed commander in chief of the Chilean army by Allende himself. Shortly after the Chamber of Deputies denounced Allende's abuses, Pinochet mobilized the army and began shelling the Moneda Palace. In despair, Allende committed suicide. After deposing Allende, Pinochet made himself the dictator of Chile. He immediately embarked upon a program of economic reform. One element of this plan was eliminating protectionist trade barriers. This was of great benefit to Chilean consumers, who could now purchase consumer imported goods at a much lower price, but also strengthened domestic firms by forcing them to compete with international competition. Initially, domestic production dropped dramatically as Chilean businesses struggled against the foreign competition and inefficient companies went bankrupt. But this was just an example of what Schumpeter labeled creative destruction. The problem of implementing protectionist tariffs in order to grow infant industries is that companies shielded from international competition often remain in this undeveloped state. Conversely, shield starvement steel. Companies that are subject to fierce international competition must adapt by reorganizing and becoming more efficient if they want to stay alive. The inefficient, poorly managed companies that cannot compete end up being cannibalized by other firms, with their factors of production being put to more efficient uses. The philosophy of the Pinochet regime was laissez faire. Let the market decide. Price controls were abolished, financial markets were deregulated, and taxes were cut. The expropriation, which had taken place under the previous regime, was reversed. The success of Pinochet's reforms was not immediately apparent, but manifested over time, as long term structural changes in the economy are wont to do. By embracing economic freedom and adopting pro business policies, the flames of the Chilean economy were stoked. Today, Chile is one of the richest countries in Latin America and enjoys a vibrant economy which is mostly free of government control. Poverty, as measured by an income of less than $7 a day, is down to 4.8%. Pinochet has been unfairly judged by history. His participation in the coup against Allende was necessary. He had to save his country from communism, from going down the path that Venezuela would travel decades later, that Cuba had gone down decades before. The context of his rule is the backdrop of international communism. If Allende had had his way, things would have been much worse. The political repression socialists faced under Pinochet was regrettable, but by driving many radicals out of the country, Pinochet saved his people from a menace even worse than dictatorship. And to his credit, Pinochet did let the people vote on his continued leadership and accepted his defeat when it occurred. Ultimately, he did suborn himself to democracy. It has been said that no one who seeks power is fit to wield it. Yet Pinochet was not a man of ambition. He did not seek out the power of the crown, but had it thrust upon him by circumstance. The tragedy of the whole situation was that Allende too was a good man, who was confronted by poverty and inequality and wanted to reform society to improve the lot of the poor. But his means were inadequate to achieve his ends, and having been poisoned by Marxist philosophy, if he was left free to pursue his agenda, he would have destroyed the Chilean society, like every other Marxist Leninist revolution before and after him.